Last week, Sean O'Brien, the president of the Teamsters Union, spoke to the Republican National Convention, which you should go watch if you haven't already. Teamsters, also known as the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, is one of the largest, oldest, and most well-known labor unions in America. Trade unions are not common here, and for many on the political left, unions like Teamsters represent a not-so-distant past where our ideals felt far more achievable. Since trade unions are one of the core mechanisms of socialism, Marxism, and left politics generally, it's common to feel activist burnout at the realization that union activity in America peaked in the 1950s and has been steadily declining ever since. But it never entirely went away, and many leftists look to the remaining unions as beacons of hope for a different future, especially recently since union activity has actually started to gain some traction again under Biden. So it's quite concerning to see the president of the Teamsters Union at the RNC. Even though this just happened, I've already seen people become very divided over whether this is a win for the labor movement or a fascist betrayal. Personally, I think it's a bit premature to make that judgment. However, I'd like to give some reasons why someone could reasonably be concerned that this is fascist. First, let's go over what he actually said, and I'll leave a link to the full speech in the description so you don't have to trust my summary. He thanks the Teamsters and Donald Trump. He explains that workers are being fucked over and everyone knows it. He says he's not like his predecessors, which sounds like an homage to the Teamsters' historic ties to the mafia, but that could be its own video. He says he's not beholden to a specific party and that he doesn't care about getting criticized, pointing out that both the far right and the far left are upset that he's speaking there. He says the left called him a traitor, which yeah, what are you doing there? He praises Trump for not being afraid of criticism and for getting shot. He again establishes that Teamsters is apolitical and that in the past they voted for Nixon, Reagan, and Bush, which points to a deeper systemic issue in unions, but again, this is a topic for another video. He says Republicans need to stop being anti-union. He praises Senator Josh Hawley for talking with Teamsters during the railroad strike. He seems to endorse J.D. Vance, Roger Marshall, Nicole Maliotakis, Mike Waller, and Brian Fitzpatrick as truly caring about working people. He says he's tired of the idea that unions destroy American companies. He rightly points out that companies only provide benefits because unions fought for them. He says corporatists hate unions, but that the Chamber of Commerce is essentially a union for big business. He says that individual workers have zero power when faced with gigantic corporations, and that it's only when we band together in democratic unions that we win higher wages and better conditions. He points out that Amazon is larger than most economies, but that it has no national allegiance, and he notes that elites have no party and elites have no nation. He establishes that working in Washington is difficult because good people go in but must face the machine. He states that working people know the system is broken and that workers have not been called essential since the pandemic. He says standard household income is shrinking due to inflation. He says it's time for both sides of Congress to stand their butts up. He says we need trade policies that put America first and that it needs to be easier for companies to remain in America and that we need bankruptcy reform. He says we need labor law reform and corporate welfare reform. He ends by challenging everyone to cooperate. Particularly, he challenges leftists. This is certainly an unusual speech, filled with dog whistles, ambiguity, and nationalism. It almost feels dirty to listen to. It almost seems like the basic function of this speech is to recuperate a population in the early stages of class consciousness after an unexpectedly successful presidency. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. This is insidious and deserves to be dissected and thoroughly cross-examined. Let's start with ambiguity. He states that workers are taken for granted without specifying how. He calls out big banks and big tech, but does not explain what's wrong with them. He uses the words corporatist and elites without specifying who he is talking about or what they've done, and culminates by saying that he wants to accomplish something real for the American worker. A certain level of ambiguity is certainly necessary here. This is, after all, the Republican National Convention. It's quite amazing that a union leader is allowed here at all, let alone allowed to give a keynote speech. Still, political ambiguity in any form is reason for concern. People use ambiguity when they're hiding something. Notice that he never explicitly endorses Donald Trump, but the message certainly seems to be that he does. He also never calls for any specific policies regarding workers' rights, instead choosing to lean into ambiguous populism that could resonate with anyone on the political spectrum. And he never attacks anyone directly. It's more like noise than speech. For example, compare this with the way Bernie Sanders talks. Sanders often makes direct references.
You all know who the Koch brothers are?
To Jeff Bezos,
To the top 1%.
Which is more vague but still specific. Sean O'Brien calls out the elites, a far less clear term that resonates with right-wingers, but which is also euphemistic enough that it could resonate with a leftist, and also corporatist, a term absolutely brimming with a whole host of unspoken presuppositions. This is annoying. Like, what are you even saying? What even is the point of this speech? We could try to fix it by clarifying some of the questions that it gestures at. How are workers being fucked over? How is the system broken? Who are the elites? What specific policies should we support with regards to the labor movement? And of course, should union workers support Donald Trump? It's also worth asking, what is a trade union for? Why are trade unions sometimes associated with socialism? And what do we mean by socialism? Those last three may seem tangential, but I think a lot of this stems from a few key misconceptions about the purpose of a trade union. That's not to say that every union worker needs to be well versed in leftist theory, but at the end of the day, if union leadership itself is openly collaborating with fascists, then what are we even doing here? Trade unions come together as a means of resistance against capitalist exploitation. They're associated with socialism, but it's worth noting that trade unions predate Marxism and most major socialist theoreticians. No one told them to organize like that. Instead, trade unions form naturally when workers come to the same realization. Working for a wage is fundamentally a kind of transaction, where workers sell their labor to a capitalist for a wage. Labor power is a commodity, just like any other, and is therefore subject to supply and demand. A worker acting in isolation will be forced to sell his commodity for whatever price the capitalist demands. If he does not, the capitalist will simply hire someone else who will, and this cycle repeats, optimizing profits for capitalists and minimizing wages for workers as much as possible. But if workers band together in a union, they can limit the supply of labor available on the market in the first place, effectively forcing employers to raise wages or make no profit at all. Trade unions give workers leverage. This is used to negotiate higher wages, but it can also be used to obtain better working conditions and even better political conditions. For example, trade unions are responsible for weekends, the 8-hour workday, overtime pay, minimum wage laws, pensions, and safety regulations. If unions are large enough, they can even be used to force changes in government by effectively threatening to shut down the economy. The greatest example of this happening occurred in Germany in 1920, where there was a failed coup attempt by a far-right proto-fascist faction, which caused the existing government to flee. It was only stopped by the German trade unions, which organized a mass strike across Germany that defeated the coup only 10 days later. Of course, this is really only a band-aid for a broken system. Capitalists want to make as much profit as possible, and this means extracting it from the workers, which is an inherently exploitative process, no matter how high of a wage they provide. A much better solution would be to remove the extracting mechanism altogether, i.e., the abolition of the capitalist class and the implementation of socialism. By socialism, I mean a system where the means of production are held in common by workers, though the phrase held in common is only meaningful by radically democratizing workplaces. This would require a high level of worker organization, such as the organization and democratic participation inherent in the framework created by a union. Given their anti-capitalist origins and potential for revolutionary organizing, many socialist theoreticians view trade unions not just as a defense against capitalist exploitation, but as the primary instrument that the working class could use to establish socialism. So again, it's very unsettling to see the president of one of the largest unions in America giving a keynote speech at the RNC. The questions, how are workers being fucked over, and how is the system broken, have the same answer. In capitalist production, workers produce value by laboring, but this value is controlled by an external party, the capitalist, who takes part of it for himself. The wage paid to the worker is never equal to the value in the product he produces. On a basic level, this is a terrible deal, like trading dimes for nickels because they're larger. But on a higher level, this is the root of all sorts of social ills. This is a core concept in leftist discourse, and a sincere socialist could have just said that. The elites screwing everyone over are quite simply capitalists, whose defining feature is the extraction of surplus value from their workers. Again, he could have just said that, but the term elites can refer to anyone, from capitalists to bankers to foreigners to Jews. Finally, should workers vote for Trump is a question that could be answered by clarifying the last question, what policies should workers support? And finally, what will Trump do for the labor movement, i.e., what policies will Trump support? Well, conveniently, we actually have Project 2025 to reference, which explicitly lays out plans to abolish overtime pay, outlaw public sector unions entirely, eliminate federal minimum wage, Rescind the persuader rule, which requires employers to disclose anti-union activities. Replace the current method of union elections via union cards with a secret election held by employers, which would obviously give employers power because if employers were in control of a secret election, they could rig the election. Initiate new investigations into worker centers. Get rid of health and safety protections. Make it harder to receive unemployment. Reform or remove child labor laws, legislation for which is already pending in many state legislatures. There are also plans to remove the current head of the National Labor Relations Board, Jennifer Abruzzo, as well as the Secretary of Labor, and hundreds of other federal employees in order to replace them with loyal party officials. Project 2025 also talks about doing away with unions entirely and replacing them with employee involvement organizations, which is the most fascist-coded shit imaginable, but more on that later. Trump has also had a pretty open record of being anti-worker both as a president and as a capitalist. He's stacked the National Labor Relations Board with union-busting, anti-labor corporate lawyers. He's already rescinded the persuader rule once. He's failed to support pro-worker legislation, like the PRO Act. He's made multiple tax cuts for billionaires. He is a billionaire, for crying out loud. He's as far from the working class as you can possibly get. While we're here, we might as well go over Biden's accomplishments because frankly there are many. Not nearly enough, he's definitely not a leftist, but Biden and his administration have done far more for workers than you would initially expect. Biden's National Labor Relations Board changed the way union elections are held to grant unions by default, making it far easier for workers to unionize. Biden's Federal Trade Commission abolished non-compete agreements just 2 months ago, and although it might not feel like it, the Inflation Reduction Act has successfully gotten inflation down from 9% to 3%. Biden has also actively worked with and expressed support for Shawn Fain, the president of the United Auto Workers Union, who is definitely not a Marxist in the same way that Sean O'Brien is definitely not a fascist. One of Biden's very first executive orders was to legalize unions for federal employees, and just last week he announced a plan to cap rent increases at 5% for tenants living in properties with more than 50 units. Biden is not good at public speaking or self-promotion or populist rhetoric in the way that Trump is, but if you want to know who would be better for workers, I mean, the data speaks for itself. It's sad, but Biden is genuinely the most pro-worker president since at least the dawn of neoliberalism. One of these candidates has made it far easier for American workers to unionize. The other has plans to destroy unionized labor altogether. And Sean O'Brien knows that. Which leads me to a more central question. What is he even doing here? Who is this for? After all, it's not like he's going to convince this crowd to be pro-union, and it's not in Donald Trump's interest for him to do so. But this speech does let Trump pretend he's somehow pro-worker, which is absurd for the reasons above, and crucially, this speech made at the Republican National Convention could potentially appeal to voters on the left. I said this speech was littered with dog whistles, which is a term we normally associate with right-wingers. Conservative dog whistles are certainly present here, like when he says, "To speak my mind and to fight like hell." But really, they're kind of an afterthought. They don't make up much of the substance of his speech. They're like dressing on the side. This speech aesthetically sounds like it's for conservatives, but most of the rhetoric would only resonate with a leftist. This is a speech for Democrats, disguised as a speech for Republicans. Specifically, this is intended to bring over vaguely left-leaning voters who aren't entirely clear about their politics, but who could be brought over by left-leaning populist rhetoric. And if that's true, then this speech is one of the most absurdly fascist things Trump and the Republicans have ever done, specifically the ending.
I challenge each and every one of you, and especially my friends on the Democratic side, to embrace cooperation, to truly collaborate, to achieve meaningful and productive change, to ensure we make this great nation in this world the bigger, faster, and strongest nation in the entire world.
Did you get that? He's calling for class collaborationism on the basis of nationality. He's pitching this like he's calling for unity, but really he means unity behind Trump. That is a Nazi tactic. Let's talk about the Nazis. It's common for right-wing pundits to pretend that Nazis were socialists because the word Nazi is short for National Socialist German Workers' Party. Cool argument, but that's where their analysis ends. Never mind that Nazis absolutely eroded workers' rights in Germany to the point of ruthlessly hunting down trade union leaders, shutting down unions, and replacing them with the German Labor Front, which were essentially puppet unions loyal first and foremost to the Nazis, or that they only came to power in part due to large donations from capitalists, or that many of those capitalists petitioned the former leader of Germany, Paul von Hindenburg, to rescind power to Hitler because they knew that he wasn't a real socialist, or that Nazi book burnings specifically targeted the texts of Marx and Engels and other socialist literature, or that the very first concentration camp, Dachau, was created specifically for communists and social democrats. But yeah, socialist. Sometimes leftists themselves ignore this naming convention or even find it embarrassing, but it's very useful to explore why they called themselves that, because the name of the Nazi Party itself in fact served several functions. It served to legitimate them. Even though the Nazis were the extreme right, socialism was so popular at the time, even if only nominally, that to be openly anti-socialist would have been political suicide. It also acted as a filter. Leaving aside its connotations in history, the term National Socialism is an oxymoron. Nationalism is inherently irreconcilable with socialism. Many well-principled socialists would have known that and had nothing to do with the party. But for many others, socialism would have just meant the Workers' Party. And this is worth expanding on. Socialism can be a somewhat vague term, which is why I gave a definition of it at the start of the video. In 1923, Hitler agreed to an interview where he defined socialism as
the science of dealing with the common weal. Communism is not socialism. Marxism is not socialism. The Marxians have stolen the term and confused its meaning. I shall take socialism away from the socialists. Socialism is an ancient Aryan, Germanic institution. Marxism has no right to disguise itself as socialism. Socialism, unlike Marxism, does not repudiate private property. Unlike Marxism, it involves no negation of personality, and unlike Marxism, it is patriotic.
There is a lot to say about this quote. First and foremost, the science of dealing with the common weal is one of the vaguest definitions I've ever seen. It says absolutely nothing about workers or means of production. I think common weal refers to general well-being, if it isn't just an antiquated spelling of weal. Either way, this is so vague as to encompass anything. Isn't the government generally the institution that deals with common welfare? It seems that Hitler's definition of socialism is essentially just when the government does stuff. Brilliant. The idea that socialism is an ancient Aryan Germanic institution is just historically inaccurate. I don't think I even need to defend that, but if anyone can be blamed for socialism, it would be various thinkers in France and England, such as Thomas Spence, Robert Owen, Charles Fourier, and Saint-Simon, as well as various Enlightenment thinkers such as Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Adam Smith. But really, none of these people caused socialism, because socialism as a movement occurred naturally as a necessary reaction to the Industrial Revolution. Marxism has no right to disguise itself as socialism. I don't think I even need to analyze this. You can really feel him projecting here, even with almost a century's distance between us. And I don't think modern right-wingers would even care to distinguish between Marxism and socialism in this way. This quote does provide us with two useful pieces of information, though. Socialism, according to Hitler, is patriotic. The Nazis probably wouldn't have cared to differentiate between patriotism and nationalism, so it isn't a stretch to say Hitler's socialism is defined in part by nationalism. Regardless of his status as a socialist, Hitler was firmly anti-Marxist. All this is to say, the Nazis were not socialists, but it was to their benefit to pretend that they were. That way, they could get as much support as possible. But this was only possible because socialism is a vague term that many people don't fully understand, which is why Nazis were nominally socialist, but openly anti-Marxist. Marxism is far clearer in its aims, but anyone can be a socialist. One of the first things National Socialists did was to replace the various German trade unions with the German National Labor Front, a system of puppet unions which did not represent workers and whose stated aim was to create a true social and productive community of all Germans, elevating nationality above class, while maintaining the nominal guise of socialism. They utilized ambiguities and common ignorance of leftist theory to perpetuate class collaborationism. the idea that different economic classes are not in dialectical tension with one another, but simply need to work together. However, the first person to do this was Benito Mussolini, who was much more honest about his politics, writing,
"No individuals nor groups, political parties, associations, labor unions, classes outside the state. For this reason, fascism is opposed to socialism, which clings rigidly to class war in the historic evolution, and ignores the unity of the state, which molds the classes into a single moral and economic reality."
Mussolini worked directly with unionized labor, taking advantage of national syndicalist movements of his time, which saw the labor movement primarily as a matter of nationalism. Mussolini was able to take that idea and stretch it into the idea that proletariat and bourgeoisie aren't inherently at odds with each other, but can work together for a common benefit of both. No matter that bourgeoisie are defined by extracting surplus value from workers. After all, they're all Italians. After all, we're all Americans. Some might say that I'm nitpicking by pointing out his use of the terminology
of the American worker.
Or even that nationalism doesn't matter in this context. It does. The main goal of this speech seems to be to draw workers to side with the RNC, a far-right nationalist party. Even if nationalism is only a small part of this speech, the fact that it's there at all is indication either of ulterior motives or of a fundamental misunderstanding of socialism. Socialist internationalism might not be as front and center as the labor theory of value, or unionization, or democracy, but internationalism is one of the most important aspects of any socialism, and without it, you don't really have socialism. Socialism and nationalism are fundamentally antagonistic, and certain conservatives know that the best way to stop socialism is by poisoning it with nationalism. This is a point Marx and Engels seem to have been keenly aware of. In response to the question, what will be the attitudes of communism to existing nationalities, Engels writes,
"The nationalities of the peoples, associating themselves in accordance with the principle of community, will be compelled to mingle with each other as a result of this association, and thereby to dissolve themselves, just as the various estate and class distinctions must disappear through the abolition of their basis, private property."
And Marx and Engels choose to open the Communist Manifesto by stating,
"It is high time that communists publish their own views. To this end, communists of various nationalities have assembled in London and sketched the following manifesto in the English, French, German, Italian, Flemish, and Danish languages."
They reaffirm this attitude at the beginning of Section 2.
In the national struggles of the proletarians of the different countries, they point out and bring to the front the common interests of the entire proletariat, independently of all nationality.
And later,
"The communists are further reproached with desiring to abolish countries and nationality. The working men have no country. We cannot take from them what they have not got. National differences and antagonisms between people are daily more and more vanishing, owing to the development of the bourgeoisie, to freedom of commerce, to the world market, to uniformity in the mode of production and in the conditions of life corresponding thereto. The supremacy of the proletariat will cause them, countries and nationalities, to vanish still faster. United action of the leading civilized countries at least is one of the first conditions for the emancipation of the proletariat. In proportion as the exploitation of one individual by another is put an end to, the exploitation of one nation by another will also be put an end to."
and the very last sentence of the manifesto is, of course,
"Working men of all countries, unite."
which is a clear call to international action. Marx and Engels even go so far as to define the communist movement itself by differentiating it from other socialist parties on this very issue.
"Communists are only distinguished from other proletarian parties by this, that in the different national struggles of the proletarians, they point out and bring to the fore the common interests of the proletariat, independent of nationality, and, again, that in the different evolutionary stages which the struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie must pass through, they represent always the interests of the movement as a whole. Thus, the communists are practically the most advanced and resolute section of the working class of all countries.
So, communism was an international movement at least since Marx and Engels, and therefore entirely irreconcilable with National Socialism. Of course, if we use Hitler's definition of socialism, this isn't a problem, but if we use a real definition, we'll immediately run into issues. But what are those issues? Why is socialism irreconcilable with nationalism? I think there are basically three reasons. Practicality. Practically, socialism restricted to the national level is simply an impossibility. Capitalism is an international movement and therefore must be confronted internationally. In the same way that it's not enough to unionize one workplace, it's not enough to communize one country. If a workplace strikes for higher wages within a saturated labor market, their employer will just fire them and find other workers. This is why unions organize not just around businesses, but around entire trades. If instead of just Ford technicians, all auto workers come together on the basis of their skill set, then their individual employers will have a much more difficult time replacing them. In the same way, if only one country gets to socialism, capital will just export production to neighboring countries, ruining the original country's economy in the process, before incorporating it back into capitalism. That's assuming a country even makes it that far. More likely than not, burgeoning socialist countries surrounding capitalist neighbors will simply intervene to overwhelm it back into submission. And there are many examples of this, especially in the very recent past. Ontology. I am American, but I am also a worker, and I am a worker in a more concrete sense than I am an American. My problems concern me as a worker. My activities concern me as a worker. When I wake up in the morning on most days, I go to work. This video took so long to write because I spend most of my time working. Nationalism wants us to believe first and foremost that you are American, and you are, but this obscures many of the actual issues we are set to face. When I get down to it, many of my political concerns have to do with economic questions. Will the price of housing rise so much that I won't be able to afford it? Will the price of food go up? Will I be able to find work? Will I get drafted to fight in war? These issues concern Americans, but primarily they concern American workers. The American ruling class, despite sharing my nationality, doesn't have to worry about these things. They don't have to worry about housing or food insecurity, as many of them are landlords, and those that aren't pay rent by extracting it from their workers. When America had the draft, many of the upper class were able to avoid it by paying a fee, something less available to the working class. By understanding myself as an American first and foremost, I obscure my analysis. I'm prone to see these issues as not being due to systemic failures of the economy, but to other nationalities. It's not our own failing economy, it's immigrants taking our jobs. It's not monopolization, it's the Chinese. I'm much more prone to xenophobia and racism, and this is exactly how the capitalist class wants me. Trying to define myself as fundamentally American is also problematic because the American identity changes. One way to sidestep this is to identify nationality with race, something more tangible. This way tries to identify me with the physical substance of my body. However, I am definitely not my body. I am what I do, and what I do most of the time is work. For a wage. I am a worker. This is also why socialists tend to be anti-war. War is based on the idea of nations in conflict, but socialists understand nationality itself as a distraction from the real issue, class warfare. It's also why socialists tend to be left on social issues as well. After all, if our main focus is to end worker exploitation, why should it matter what race you are? We're both workers. The conflict is between workers and owners. Focusing on nationality just obscures it, which is why it's strange to hear Sean O'Brien condemn Amazon for lacking a nationality, and that trade policies need to put America first. That's not the point of the labor movement. It's a distraction from the real issue. The problem isn't how unpatriotic Amazon is. The problem is that Amazon exists in the first place. Anti-fascism. Socialism is a workers' movement. It's not a white workers' movement. It's not an Italian workers' movement, or an American workers' movement, or a working man's movement. It is a workers' movement. We are concerned about the exploitation of workers. Nationality, or any group identity for that matter, is secondary. Frankly, not emphasizing that socialism is not a nationalist movement heightens the probability of socialists missing the point entirely. This is important because far-right movements have often emerged as reactions to workers' movements which have become large enough to be effective. It's not uncommon in these contexts for far-right movements to start off by posing as workers' movements themselves before revealing their true intentions. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, the British Union of Fascists, the Spanish Syndical Organization, and today, what right-wing politician doesn't pretend to be a populist? Basically, if you let socialism and nationalism sit together for too long, you get National Socialism. To reiterate my point at the start, this speech feels like an attempt at recuperating a population in the early stages of class consciousness. Recuperation is a tendency within capitalism theorized by the Situationist International. It refers to the process by which capital neutralizes and incorporates a subversive, dangerous, or otherwise revolutionary aspect of culture which arises to oppose capital, warping and zombifying it until it only possesses the aesthetic of its former self. Think of how punk rock and folk music used to be overtly political, making clear references to anarchism and trade unions, and even a need for political violence. Today, these genres don't stand for much of anything, but they inherit the aesthetic. When people talk about recuperation, they tend to use examples like these from the modern day. The go-to examples are things like punk, climate activism, and movies about resistance which provide workers with a sense of catharsis. But recuperation is much older than postmodernity. Is this not exactly what happened to the Italian and German workers' movements back in the 20s and 30s? Far from being restricted to art and music, socialism itself can be recuperated. Fascism arises to channel the potential energy of a radicalized working class away from anything actually revolutionary while maintaining the aesthetic of revolution. It provides the sensation of resistance while changing nothing. It's fake. Therein lies the solution to the question, why is National Socialism called socialism? National Socialism is recuperated socialism. This is a very shitty attempt at recuperation, but I do think that's what's happening here. Biden's presidency, for all its flaws, marks a historic shift in the labor movement. For the first time since the 1950s, labor unions seem to be regaining momentum. Socialism is regaining popularity, and the capitalist class is noticing. For a while in America, socialism as a term was so taboo that to be associated with it was political suicide. Politicians use socialism as an insult, and many people even use socialism interchangeably with authoritarianism. But frankly, it's not. And that level of society-wide gaslighting is only sustainable for so long. We're reaching a point in history where being openly anti-socialist isn't politically advisable anymore. Soon enough, they're going to have to start pandering to us. Soon enough, they'll be calling themselves socialists. Sean O'Brien is just the start.